welcome to the Social Thread podcast. At Social Thread, you can be a part of a community where you can thrive and belong and explore your faith on your own terms. I'm Robert Payne.
And I'm Rob Reinders.
Awesome. And today on our episode, we are going to talk about sacred texts. Another real easy one.
Yeah, we only serve up softballs around here.
I love it. I love it. We will be in and out of here in just a few minutes, I'm sure.
Yes. That is actually the goal, I think.
Yeah. So, Rob, what do we mean by sacred texts?
Yeah. So for thousands of years, people have looked to these sacred stories and writings to help them develop not just their understandings and beliefs about God, but about the world, about themselves, about, why things are happening and how they're supposed to structure and live their lives, essentially. So, we all know about, and we've all heard about sacred texts, and we've probably, many of us grew up using them and understanding them and in our own tradition if we had them. So, obviously, if you're Jewish, your sacred text is the Torah. The Torah. I promise I can talk. And then, Buddhists have the sutras and other texts that contain the teachings of Buddha and other teachers. And Islam has the Quran. And, even humanists and secularists look to great works of poetry, of literature, and of science and of politics to help make sense of the world and to base their decisions and lives off of. And Christians, of course, believe the Bible, which contains what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament, which Christians believe in the New Testament and both of those reveal who God is, particularly through the life and teachings of Jesus. So regardless of what texts and various faiths and philosophical frameworks we turn to, groups of adherents within each tradition even still have their own wide-ranging of what those texts mean to them. You can have 10 people in a room and all of them looking at a particular text, like the book of Mark in the New Testament, in the Bible, and you'll have 10 different interpretations of what even one line of that says and means. So again, I think at Social Thread, we don't try to say that there's a right or wrong understanding or interpretation of a sacred text, but that whichever one resonates with you is the one we want to help you journey with. And the one that's going to resonate with you and your understanding of God or that higher power is. Again, I think some people think these are really outdated and irrelevant at times, but it's important to remember that these stories still have a deeper meaning and understanding of who we are, even if we don't quite understand them now. Back when they were originally written, they had a deep and powerful understanding for the context of that community at that time.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, I think that one of the biggest, when you look at ancient texts, one of the biggest words that sometimes that you take is applied to some of these ancient texts is the word myth.
Mm-hmm.
This is but at first, the word myth can conjure up mental images of being, it's made up or it's make believe, but but it's actually, something that's more deeper and more meaningful than that. Karen Armstrong says myths are universal and timeless stories that reflect and shape our lives. They explore our desires, our fears, our belongings, and provide narratives that remind us of what it means to be human.
I really like that quote, and a great example of that is the other day someone was asking me on social media like, hey, I don't understand why these certain books in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible are there. Some of the ones that are just kind of filled with these what look like really archaic laws and stories of death and of violence. They said these are not relevant to our time anymore. So I think when we talk about myth, yeah, again, people say, oh, well, you're discounting my religious experience or my sacred text by calling it myth. You're calling it made up, make believe. Well, on the other side, we say, like, okay, no, maybe that wasn't a myth. Maybe it did happen, but it's such like a terrible thing. And why would we want to gain moral or ethical guidance or life advice from a story that just seems so horrible? But I think there's something, I think there's a third thing going on here again, is that these stories, whether they happened or not, they again describe the experience of a people at a particular place and time and can even provide lessons to us now by understanding what they were going through back then. So in these particular books I was talking about with this person, it was of the Israelites, continually getting conquered and enslaved and, just going through all these horrible, terrible things. Well, but the lesson that comes out of those books really is they were folks trying to warn future communities, their own people in the future, saying, hey, every time we don't take care of each other, every time we neglect to love our neighbor, somebody comes in and conquers us. We get into another war. There's another famine. There's another drought. Something's going on here. And so it's not that necessarily that God is punishing us. God is continuing to give us this opportunity to take care of one another, and we continue to drop the ball. And I think that's a timeless lesson. And I think that's an important one that when we think about how a myth or a story or history can teach us, it can continue to do it, whether it happened thousands of years ago or if it happened yesterday. I think the lesson is still the same. So I think that's how I look at sacred texts. They can be really powerful, even though they may seem irrelevant today.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think because I'm a Christian. My ancient text, the one that I study, is the Bible, and one of the filters that if you look at these, if you look at the stories in the Bible, if you look, say, at an Old Testament story or a New Testament story, and you're asking yourself, well, I'm not sure if that really happened or not, but I think the point really when I'm looking at the text is I'm wondering, and I really ask the question is, so this at some point was really important for someone to write down to say, hey, now this is a teaching point where we want you to know that we think this happened or that this happened. The real question is, well, why was it important for that person to write that down so that they would say, hey, this is how it happened, or this is how, as if it was history, this is how it happened. And so if I approach the text like that, I say Jesus calming the storm, or after Jesus is raised from the dead, there's a whole lot of other people raised from the dead and started walking around, or stories turning water into wine, or the Tower of Babel. All of these stories, the Genesis creation story, at some point somebody wrote those down saying, hey, this is how it happened, or this is how our view of how it happened. And I think the real question is for me, is the interpretation of why did somebody take the time to write that down in that way. And so for me, answering the question of whether or not it really happened or didn't really happen, to me, that's a point of history and of historical context, of where you can draw a conclusion, but I'm really not looking at this ancient text as purely a historical document. That that in here I'm looking for meaning that's deeper than just, hey, how did this happen really in history? Did that really happen? Did that event really happen? Because I don't know if that it's quite the point. And that surely you can grab historical context out of the whole Bible, but I think the point of looking at the ancient text is not just to say, hey, this is a book of history, but what is the deeper meaning that I'm drawing from this, and how is this impacting how I live?
Yeah, I think you're right on. Both can be true, but also, I think what we really want folks to take away is spend time with that text. What is it saying? What can you do to understand it better? Who can you talk about it with? And again, that's what we're trying to help folks along that journey. And that's not something that has easy answers or quick answers, but again, there's so many resources out there, and the internet where you can go and learn about these things and explore them more than you ever could. So that's what we want folks to do with sacred texts is pick something, even something that maybe especially something that you are not familiar with. So if you grew up in a different in one particular faith tradition, then pick another one and go to the library, check that text out, spend some time with that. And, how is it the same? How is it different than your own tradition? I think that's what we want folks to be able to challenge themselves to do. Okay.
All right. Hey, that was a great conversation, Rob. That was, I think we probably could spend maybe a few hours talking about that. And, and I'm hoping that everybody listening to this podcast really takes this seriously and really wrestles with these ancient texts and to truly find and explore their faith on their own terms. And so anyway, you can find Social Thread at socialthread.org, and you can, of course, support the nonprofit there as well. If you want to get involved, it's pretty easy. You can just go over to the website, click the Get Involved button right there, and you can quickly be a part of a community to help you thrive and belong and explore your faith on your own terms. All right, Rob, we'll see you next week.
Take care, everybody.